Our guest today, Jane Bomba, is an outside director for three different public companies, as well as an advisory board member for the University of Michigan, my alma mater. Before she started her own consulting firm, Saddle Ridge Consulting, located just outside Denver, Jane was the Chief Administrative Officer and Chief Sustainability Officer for IHS Markit. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Jane, the board and ESG, very timely issue, probably the number one issue of the day, I would say. Overall, we're going to be talking about how on top of ESG should the board be, but should each board have one or more experts on ESG issues to sort of lead the way to be the champion?
Yeah, thanks, Brock. So I think in terms of a board's responsibility with regard to ESG, we're at a very important inflection point right now. I think a lot of the legal duties of boards, those have not changed, and those are not going to change. Duty of care, duty of loyalty, making decisions on an informed basis, right? Looking out for the best interests of the company, protecting the assets. Those haven't changed. I think what we're seeing in this inflection point, though, is relative to ESG and the board's fiduciary responsibility around ESG. And there never used to be a specific duty around that or fiduciary responsibility about that. But I think we have seen the expectation shift in the last year or two particularly. And I think this started to happen even before COVID and some of the other really remarkable events that we've seen happen recently. I think those things are going to continue to accelerate this so that a board does have a responsibility to be knowledgeable about ESG, to be helping to oversee in a board type role ESG, and to help support management in ESG. And I think that can take a lot of different forms. I don't think you need to have a specific expert on ESG on the board. There are so many topics within ESG that are really important to a company's long-term success. Those vary based on industry. You know, boards are well served to have at least some board members who are familiar with the industry on the board. But, you know, we've long seen governance be covered on a board, right? ISS and Glass Lewis and some of the actions of larger institutional shareholders really pushed boards to be on top of governance. I think what we're seeing even more acutely right now is more focus on environment and social, particularly around subjects like climate change and human capital management. So I definitely think the tide has shifted and boards absolutely have to be on top of ESG.
And for those directors who don't have a background in E&S, how much should they build up their expertise? How far do they need to go, do you think?
I think it's like any other subject, right? You're not going to have every board member who is expert in, for example, cybersecurity and cybercrime risk. You're not going to have every director who is an expert on human capital management and on compensation best practices, right? So you either need to build a board that has varied skills, which would be the ideal. Those can be supplemented by bringing in advisors and consultants as needed. I think most importantly, there has to be a real tone at the top, both at the board level and at the executive team level within an organization, that clearly communicates that ESG and beginning to measure and track and perform against certain metrics are a company imperative going forward, right? So somebody with an authority inside the organization I don't think there's any one place that ESG belongs. I think ideally you'd probably have a head of ESG, but depending on company size and resources, not every company can do that. But I think the most important thing is that person, whoever it is, has authority, and has full support of the executive team and the board.
And then how best can directors build it up? You and I are taping separate Vid-Guides about board presentations on ESG and board materials regarding ESG. Is that how they build up expertise, or some sort of certification? I just recently saw an email about certification for directors about cybersecurity, and you know,
Right.
I don't know how legitimate that is, but I imagine those sort of certification programs inevitably will come around E&S. Is that
Sure, just like they are for so many other topics, right? So, NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, certainly ESG has become a much larger part of NACD programming in the last several years. I think it's important for whichever member of management is coming into the boardroom to present about what the company is doing, to provide really solid context about, not only where the company stands and what the goals are going to be, but also how the outside world sees the company's performance around this. I mean, ultimately, as a board, you're not going in to do the work yourself. You're in an oversight role. But I think an important part of the oversight role that board members can play is to ask a lot of questions about the framework that's being used to measure ESG performance, to sort of understand any of maybe the financial implications of performance against some of these metrics, to understand where the company is doing well and where there are opportunities for improvement, particularly relevant to the industry that company is operating within. And so just like anything else, you may have directors who are not expert in the industry, but they learn about the industry through various presentations and materials that are sent to board members, to understand how your particular company is performing relative to others and what best in class looks like. So sure, I think there are certifications. I think there are a lot of webinars and white papers and classes, and you don't need directors. I don't think you need directors to be absolute experts in ESG, but they have to understand how the ESG metrics apply to their company.
Yeah, it's a tough time to be a director, just like it's a tough time to be in anything, but the pace of change, even beyond the pandemic, has accelerated so much. But even just within, ESG itself, my hat's off to you. It's a challenge for sure, I imagine.
It is, and to be quite honest, I think it's a long road and there is a lot of work to be done. I mean, I think you and I have both seen a lot of the statistics around this, and we've heard from some of the large institutional investors. Companies have a long way to go, and it's really a shift in thinking, because most companies do not have frameworks or even systems to capture the data, to start thinking about consistent disclosure, right? You're going to need auditable systems for a lot of this data, but I think that's a board's role, to be asking the questions about what data do we think is important to capture? What metrics should we be measuring, right? What does it look like when we start making progress against those metrics, right? And how are you capturing all of that, right? So to give management support for that. One of the board's most important roles is involvement in strategy and making sure that a company has the right strategy and isn't executing against the strategy. Well, that's also very important here, right? Because as we continue to move down the road, and probably the very best in class companies are doing this already, but ESG has to be a core part of strategy and of culture. It can't be a separate function or discipline, right? It has to be woven into the fabric of who the company is and how the company operates. And that certainly is something that a board should provide oversight for.
Yeah, I have separate Vid-Guides about that issue, like 3 different ways, how investors can assess whether a company has truly done that or whether the reporting that they're doing publicly is more about window dressing. And then also, of course, how can boards do that? How can companies do that? Because you can't do that on a dime. It takes quite a bit of time to change your strategy, to integrate something new into your strategy.
Well, it's a massive effort. To think about what you should be doing in the first place is a massive effort. And then to really re-examine your strategy, right? And to make sure that these factors are taken into account in strategy. We never sat around talking about some of the core elements of ESG when we talked about what our strategy should be. I've had a multi-decade career in corporate and have been involved in a lot of strategic planning sessions, and that was just never a subject that came up.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.